Good evening, everyone. I'm Maria. I'm your host for this evening, and we are thrilled to have Ginny Myers Sain
outside
with us this evening at RJ Julia Booksellers in Madison to talk with us about her latest book, Secrets So Deep. And full disclosure, I just finished the book this morning, so I was really happy to write.
She remembers more about it than I do. It's very
Introduction. Good. Although Ginny currently resides in Oklahoma and then just came to us by way of Florida, I think we might consider her an honorary Connecticut author. And if you've read the book, you'll probably know why I'm saying that. Ginny is a self-professed theater lover, and she spent multiple summers at the Eugene O'Neill Theater Center on the Connecticut shoreline. According to Ginny, the setting for Secrets, which takes place at a theater camp for teens, was inspired by the coastal home of the Eugene O'Neill Center in Waterford. So kind of the Waterford, New London area. Besides the book's beautiful and wild depiction of the Long Island Sound waters, Ginny's story is a marvelous mixture, part mystery, part ghost tale, part love story. Ultimately, I found it to be a novel about young people finding their own identities, or as one of the main characters describes it, becoming. Readers may find themselves similarly haunted by secrets so deep long after they turn the final page of this unforgettable book. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Ginny Myers Sain.
Thank you. That's great. I'm gonna have her come with me and use me everywhere. Like that's awesome. So I'm really excited to be here. Let me ask before the end, is anyone here a sea captain? Okay, this isn't strange because I did an event in Mystic the other night, and there were quite a few people there, and there was an unusually large percentage of like boat people there. And so when I started talking about some of the things that are in the book, they got very excited. They're like, "Oh, I know about that." So I didn't know if that was just a Connecticut thing or just it was a coincidence that they happened to be shopping in Mystic that night. But I am happy to be here in Connecticut. I am from Oklahoma. I grew up in Oklahoma. Spent all of my life in Oklahoma or Arkansas, which are probably places you've heard of but never been. But if you know where they are on the map, you at least know that they're like terribly landlocked states, right? And we don't have any coastline in Oklahoma or Arkansas. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this book and why, how it came to be and why it ended up being set here in Connecticut where it's set and that sort of thing. So I have a first novel that came out a year ago, last fall. That's this one over here, Dark and Shallow Lies. That book is set in Louisiana. It's set in the far, far south Louisiana, down south of New Orleans. And most people don't even know that there is anything south of New Orleans. That's because there's really not. There are like 2 or 3 towns on the highway south of New Orleans before you just run out of land, basically. And that's where that book is set. I'm not from Louisiana either, but I did spend a lot of time there growing up. I have cousins that live there. We went there a lot. I had a boyfriend that was from there in college, and I went there and spent many summers with him. So that story grew out of my love for that place, that particular location. And the same thing is true with Secrets So Deep. When I started thinking about the second book that I knew I was going to write, because I had a 2-book deal with my publisher, Penguin, so I knew they were going to ask for a second one, I had started thinking about the story that I wanted to tell. And I knew I wanted to tell a story about memory and the slipperiness of memory and how we know that the things we remember are real or not. And one of the things that always intrigued me growing up was I'm the oldest of 3 kids. And I had heard so many stories about myself as a young child that I felt like I remembered. But looking back and thinking, about how old I was, I don't think that there's any way I could possibly remember those things. I think it's that I had heard those stories so many times and in so much detail, and they're the kind of stories that get repeated, that I felt like I remembered them. But I'd always been interested in sort of that idea of memory and whether or not it's trustworthy and how we know we can rely on it. So I knew I wanted to tell a story about that. I have spent pretty much all of my life working in the theater as a director and acting teacher, particularly with high school students. I worked with kids for many, many years who were very intent on pursuing professional careers in the theater. So not just your regular high school acting class, but these were kids that were really intent on either majoring in theater in college or going on to an actor training program. And our goal was to get them into good schools and good programs. So it was kind of like AP theater is kind of what I taught for high school students. So I knew I wanted to write for kids that age. And I knew that I wanted to tell a theater story because theater has always been my chosen art form. It was kind of in my blood from the time I was born. So when I started thinking about where to set that story, I knew I wanted a setting that was really captivating and atmospheric and would be as interesting to people as the setting of Dark and Shallow Lies, that Louisiana Bayou setting. And the first place that came into my mind was the coast of Connecticut. I spent 6 summers working at the Eugene O'Neill Theater Center in Waterford. Have you guys ever been to the O'Neill? Anybody ever been there? So if you know anything about Waterford and New London, that area, it's adjacent to Harkness Park. It's a really beautiful area. It's right on the water. And to a girl, the first year I went there was my junior year in college, and I ran the box office there. So to a girl from Oklahoma, which is very dry and very dusty and very not on the coast, it was like this completely other place. It was like I had landed on some other planet for the summer, and it was amazing. I was so grateful to not be at home where it was 104 degrees. Where everything was dead and brown and just, horrible in the summer. It was such a treat to come here and to be right on the beach and to be able to walk down to the water and to be cool. And, I just remember thinking, oh my gosh, this is amazing. I can wear like shorts during the day, but jeans and a hoodie at night. And this is perfect. This is where I want to live. So I really fell in love with that whole area, with everything about it. Because it was such a different, it was such a different thing from what I was used to. So when I went to start to set a story, that's where I knew I wanted to set it. And now, because I've never been to Madison before, but we're pretty close to the water too, right? So at the O'Neill, because of the way the geography is there's a big lawn that kind of slopes down to the water, and then you've got the water is right there. And every night, what would happen is this incredible fog would roll in off the water, and the foghorn would start to sound, and it was so strange and so unusual for me, particularly coming from Oklahoma, because all of a sudden, all of the things that seemed familiar during the day and the things that I thought I knew and the directions I knew kind of got messed up in my head once that fog started to roll in, and distances seemed different and directions seemed different, and it was just a very disorienting and strange experience. And because the O'Neill sits kind of in a little dip, in a little bowl, between two sort of high places, that fog kind of gathers there, and it does get really thick, and it's very confusing. And that's something that I always kind of tucked away in the back of my head, and something that I pulled out to use in that story. So that's how we ended up on the Connecticut coast for this book. And since those 6 summers, I've come back to this area many times as an acting teacher and a director. I've brought students back to the O'Neill 5 or 6 different summers. I've brought my son back here, for vacations and all kinds of stuff. If you haven't been to the O'Neill, it's basically what it is a cradle for the American theater. It's a development project for new plays and new musicals to feed the American theater. So they call it like the cradle for Broadway or off-Broadway productions. So I brought kids here for that. There are lots of places in this book that if you are familiar with that area would be recognizable to you. They were sort of thinly disguised. We were just talking about Abbott's Lobster in Noank, if you've ever been to Abbott's. Which is the best place in the world to get a really good hot lobster roll. That's here in the book. There's Michael's Dairy in New London, is in here sort of by another name. But there are lots of local landmarks like that made its way in here. And another thing that I wanted to do, particularly with this book, is something I did with Dark and Shallow Lies as well. In that book, because it's set in the bayou of Louisiana, there's a lot of Cajun folklore that gets kind of woven into the story. There are there's a rougarou, which is the Cajun werewolf. He gets in there, and some other kind of folk tales and legends and lore from that particular area that get wound up and woven into that story. And I wanted to do that same thing with Secret So Deep, but you guys are fresh out of werewolves in Connecticut. There are not a lot of Connecticut werewolves. So I did some research on like cryptozoology and strange things. Do you guys have any is there anything weird running around Connecticut? I didn't really find anything. So I scrapped that idea. And what I ended up going with in this story are some old whaling legends and some whaling lore and that sort of thing, because that's what you do have a lot of. And I remembered when I was here, the very first year that I was here, we had a big gala for the O'Neill, a big fundraiser at Mystic Seaport. And one of the things that happened during that was they had these storytellers come in who were, at the Seaport, if you've ever been there, they do reenactments. So they're, his like period costume, historical dress, and all of that. And they tell their stories and act out their stories. So at this particular event, they were telling all about this really cool like whaling lore and legends and superstitions. So that's what I ended up taking to work into this story. So if you read this book, there's a little bit of that sort of thing woven through it. There are some maritime superstitions and some whaling legends and lore that get worked into it, in much the same way that Cajun folklore gets worked into Dark and Shallow Lies. So I really wanted this. The setting's really important in all the stories that I tell. So I wanted to make sure that the setting for this story as well, was not just a backdrop for the story, but that it was something that was tangible in the story, something that really affected the characters and the things that they were doing and the way they move through the space and the way they react to what happens in the story. So to flesh all of that out was really fun, and to be able to do it in a place that I really love was really exciting too, since I've spent a lot of time here and keep coming back because, like I said, I've been sort of captivated by this part of the country since I was pretty young, right out of college. So these are both thrillers. They're both mysteries. They have some magical elements to them. They have a little bit of that thread of the supernatural or the paranormal running through them, although they're both set in very realistic worlds. So they're not fantasy per se, but they do have that element of fantasy to them. They're also both YA novels. They are written for young adults from a young adult perspective. The main character of both these stories is 17. But I can tell you that the readers that I get comments from and emails and messages and things are pretty evenly split between young adults and adults. There are a lot of adult readers of YA. I happen to be one of them. But I do get a lot of comments from adults as well. These are also both pretty dark books. They're pretty scary, and there's some pretty heavy, dark themes. Both of these books deal pretty extensively with grief and with loss and with memory and all of those things. So they're definitely not books for necessarily for young kids, but they're written primarily for young adults, although I'm always glad when adults love them. So that's kind of a breakdown of kind of where the story came from. This book is about a girl whose mother drowned 12 years ago at this coastal theater on the sea. And she has some very unusual memories of what happened that night, some things that don't necessarily make sense. She's been told her whole life what happened, but it's never quite matched up with the things she remembers that don't really make sense. So she's come back to the theater now as a 17-year-old herself to try to not only figure out what happened to her mother that night, but really to connect with her mom, because she doesn't really have any memories of her. She doesn't have a lot. She's never felt very connected to her as a person. And now that she's at a point in her life where she is trying to sort of discover who she is and who she wants to be, she feels like knowing her mother and understanding her story is kind of important to her journey of as you said, as becoming the person that she wants to become. So that's kind of the gist of it, and the information about what the book is about and how we got to Connecticut from Oklahoma. Which is why I mentioned the boat people that were at the event the other night, because one of the characters in here has a compass rose tattoo, which he says is good luck. And one of the guys that was there the other night actually had one too, so that was kind of fun. Anyone has a tattoo that you'd like to share with us, let me know. That was unexpected, but it was fun. So that's kind of it. Unless do you guys have any questions? Anything I can answer for you, or anything you'd like to know about the story, about either one of them?
Yeah, I was wondering the fog, which
I spent a lot of time on Nantucket and
Mhm.
a lot of time down the Connecticut shore. So it seemed a little excessive until I kind of substituted that for the fogginess of this young woman's memories without giving away too much.
Mhm.
Am I making too much of a
Oh,
difference?
no,
I
no,
just
no.
experienced that much fog.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's definitely heightened. Like, there are a lot of things, any kind of a thriller or mystery that are heightened like that. And there was a lot of fog. There's a lot of fog on the grounds of the O'Neill. In fact, the first 2 days I was there, I had gotten this internship the first year, my junior year in college. And like I said, I'd only lived in Oklahoma and Arkansas. And I had come up here sight unseen, to come here for the summer and do run the box office for 3 months at the O'Neill. And when the taxi dropped me off at the main house there in Waterford at the O'Neill, I knew from the woman I had talked to on the phone that it was right on the water. Like she had said, oh, it's so great. You can walk to the beach, we're right on the water. But when I got out of the taxi, there was no water. I was like, I don't see any water. I see some grass and some clouds. I see no water. And I was like, well, that's weird. So it was kind of getting dark. And I thought, well, maybe the morning when the sun comes up. And so the next day I got up, no water, no water anywhere to be seen. All day I kept looking at there thinking, yeah, there's no water. I don't know how far we are from the water, but we're a little further than she made it out to seem like we were. And then the third day, finally, the sun came out and the clouds lifted and the fog burned off and there was water. It was literally right there. But I had not been able to see it for the first 2 days we were there. And so the fog does get really thick there. And I think that's partly because of the unusual geography there. And it's a little bit weird, the way it kind of sits there between those two sort of higher places. So it kind of gathers in a little bowl. But like anything else, it is heightened. And certainly, yeah, I mean, the fog is definitely also a metaphor for the fog of memory and the fog of kind of finding your way through those memories that you're unsure of. And in the book, of course, there's some other things about Whisper Cove that sort of set it apart and make it a little different. And that fog definitely has an element of the otherworldly to it as well. So it's not necessarily normal fog for sure.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah.
So how long did it take you to write each of the books? And was there any point when you were writing either of the books, did you get stuck or?
Oh yeah, many points. Are you a writer by chance? No, anybody here a writer? Anybody write? Okay, so the first book I wrote in about 6 months, probably. And at that time, when you set out to write a book originally, you're the first, you're hoping someone will eventually publish it and that you'll be able to sell it eventually. But you don't know that, when you're writing it. So it's just kind of a lot of faith and hope and keeping your fingers crossed, right? And particularly if you're going to go with traditional publishing as opposed to like self-publishing, because if you want to do traditional publishing, you need to get an agent, you need to get that work in front of, some publishing houses. And it's a really complicated, long, drawn out, difficult process. So you're just kind of going on hope and the possibility. So I wrote that in about 6 months. The reason that I did it so fast was because I had won a scholarship to a huge yearly writers conference in LA. I belong to the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators, and they do a yearly conference every year in LA that's editors and agents, and it's a huge thing. And I had this scholarship to go, and I thought, well, if I'm going to go out there, they're going to pay for me to go. I should go with a finished book so that, if someone asks, what do you have, then I don't have to say, well, eventually I'll have a book that I'll finish. So I wanted to have it finished. So I did that in about 6 months. And then once I got an agent and once the book sold and all of that, I got a 2-book contract, which means that when Penguin Random House and Razorbow, which is an imprint of Penguin Random House, gave me a contract for Dark and Shallow Lies, they included a second book with it. So I knew all along there was going to be a second book. And that one was written in about 4 months, just because of the way the timeline works out, which is really fast for writing a book. And I have friends that have been working on books for like 8 or 10 years. And they always say, well, what's your secret? Like, how do you write a book so fast? Like, what's the key to writing quickly? And I always say, it's really helpful if you've already signed a contract and your editor has given you a deadline and they've already paid you for part of it. And that makes it really easy to get it together and actually get it written. So pretty quickly. and turnaround time isn't always that fast, you know, in the publishing world, these were kind of on a tight schedule.
What's your process like? Do you write at the same time in the same place? Or?
Well, you know, I don't have one. I should think about getting one. I don't have one. And that's partly because part of the reason I was drawn to writing in the first place is because I wanted to have a life that was very flexible. I wanted that flexibility. And when I started writing, I had a son who was just getting ready to start high school. You know, and he was traveling a lot. His father lives out of state. And so we were kind of back and forth a lot. We traveled around a lot, and I really was drawn to the flexibility of that. So I don't have a lot of writers do thrive on that process, you know, that, you know, I write every day from 9 to 12, or, you know, I write so many words a day, and I stick to that no matter what. I definitely don't. So the answer to that is, if I am on deadline and that deadline is quickly approaching, I write a lot. If I am not on deadline and the deadline is not quickly approaching, I'm a little more carefree with how much time I spend on it. And that you know, I think partly that's because having worked in the theater my whole life, I've never had a real job, and I really didn't want one. Where, you know, like you have to show up at a certain time every day and do the same thing on a certain schedule. And so that's part of why I haven't ever sort of pinned that process down.
Just a quick follow-up. Do you outline or do you?
Yeah, I do outline. And so, are you a writer? No. Okay, we ask good writer questions. In the writer world, you're either a pantser or a plotter, is kind of what they say. So if you're a plotter, then you figure out your plot before you go, you have your outline and all of that. And if you're a pantser, which is what they call it, you kind of fly by the seat of your pants, which means you're sort of like making it up as you go. And I kind of do a combination of both. I'm kind of a plantser, I guess, would be what you call it. I plot the big things out, the big plot points. So I know A, B, C, and D. Like, I know what those major turning points are and that the story hinges on. What I don't know and what I don't outline or try to figure out in advance is how I'm going to get from A to B to C. And for me, that's what that discovery process is. I know this has to happen. This is the midpoint reveal, the reversal. This is the really, you know, the thing that has to happen at that midpoint that's going to throw it all into chaos. I don't necessarily know how I'm going to get from here to here. So I kind of explain it like, it's like if I'm going on vacation and I know what city I'm going to. So I know kind of like what weather to expect and what there is to do there. I know how I'm going to get there, you know, a plane or train or whatever, but I don't necessarily know what I'm going to eat for dinner when I get there or what museums I'm going to get to. And the little things like that, I kind of leave up to the process as I go along. Yeah. Yeah.
So I know you're on your tour for your new book, but do you have things that you're excited to work on next?
Yes, I do. Yeah, actually, this has been sort of the wildest month for me, because I have lived in Oklahoma my whole life, but we just bought a house in Florida right before a hurricane, which was really smart on our part. We didn't know that was going to happen, but it's all good. It's not flooded. We're really grateful. And so we just bought a house and literally in the process of moving. In my first book, Dark and Tell Lies, was the Barnes and Noble pick of the month for September, the YA pick. So I was at a lot of Barnes and Noble stores and doing a lot of events and promo and stuff with them, which was really fun. And of course, Secret So Deep just came out on the 27th, so at the end of September. So that was really exciting. All of you know, all good things. But it was a jam-packed month. So the other thing that happened in September as well is that I got to announce my third book, which will be coming also from Razor Bill Penguin, same publisher and same editor, which I'm really grateful about and really excited to be able to stick with them because you know, I love working with them. And my next book is called, right now it's called One Last Breath. That could change. Titles change a lot before they come to the shelves in the bookstores. But it is also another YA thriller, and it has some paranormal and magical elements too. It's actually set in Florida, in the freshwater springs of Central Florida. It's about a girl who's a free diver there, and that was planned before I knew I was moving to Florida, so it works out great. But yeah, that's what I'm working on. And then there'll be a fourth book as well, because that's another 2-book contract. I'm not sure exactly what that fourth book is going to be. I have some ideas that are, you know, kind of percolating and rolling around in the back of my head. So we'll see what happens after that.
So the Deep Springs, Wakulla Springs.
Wakulla is one of them, yeah. Yeah, so Wakulla is the deepest freshwater spring in the world. It's right outside Tallahassee.
Yeah, I lived in Tallahassee.
Awesome, yeah. They're not at Wakulla Springs, but actually the spring that is in the story is modeled after Silver
Yes.
Glen Springs in the Ocala National Forest.
Yeah.
But they do mention Wakulla Springs. We've been to Wakulla a lot of times in
And
the
the creature from
boat
the
ride,
Black
yeah.
Lagoon.
Creature from the
Have
Black
you
Lagoon
watched
was
it?
still there, yeah. So it was really fun. Again, and that's a setting that I'm really personally attached to. Spent a lot of time in those springs, and you know, we go all the time and we tube and we float and we swim and we snorkel and all that kind of stuff. So again, it's a setting that I'm really excited about sharing with people.
Well, that makes sense that you like to take pictures of alligators, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, see, that's why, because we don't have alligators. Well, we do now, kind of in the southwest corner, but we didn't when I was growing up have alligators in Oklahoma.
Yeah.
I don't know how they
think
got
so.
there. They weren't supposed to be there, but they're kind of there now. But we didn't have them, so I was always fascinated with them. So yeah, I do love alligators.
Sorry, Patrick, didn't mean to cut you off.
No, you're good. Two-part question. What is your favorite part about writing, and what is your least favorite or most difficult part about writing?
Yeah, okay. So my favorite part about writing is actually rewriting. So like editing is fun. I like to edit. I love to go back and make things perfect. I love to go back, you know, and really make those sentences sing and make those descriptions really work. And that's fun. So I love editing. That's great. I can edit all day long. Drafting is not fun for me, or I can't imagine for anyone. I mean, there's probably someone who enjoys drafting in the same way that there's probably someone who enjoys hot yoga, but it is not me in either one of those cases. So drafting is just a lot of hard work, and it's, you know, it's like kind of hitting your head against the wall over and over again, and knowing that what you're doing is not great, or often not even good, but then hopefully you get to go back later and, you know, make it. So it's a difference between like building a house, which is really hard work, and decorating a house, which is a lot of fun.
Mhm.
I'd rather decorate the house than build it, but you can't decorate a house you have not built, unfortunately. Or so you do have to build it first. That's a good question. Thanks.
Thank you.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, I had another question about when you started writing, were there specific authors that were really, you know, a big influence on you that you like could see reflect in the way?
Yeah. Good. I always loved stories that were sort of dark and creepy and spooky. So, you know, as a kid, I read I read like Shirley Jackson, and I read like a lot of Lois Duncan. I don't know if you guys know Lois Duncan is, but she wrote sort of young adult horror, supernatural thriller. So I loved her stuff. And my favorite book growing up was Rebecca. You know, which is a very atmospheric sort of mystery, sort of dark and brooding. So I think all of those stories kind of came into play. I come from a family of writers. My mom is a writer, and she writes middle grade historical fiction primarily. She has 19 of those middle grade novels out, all big award winners, historical fiction pieces. There's nothing similar about the way we write or the type of stories we tell, or, you know, anything about us as writers, except that I grew up in a home full of writers, knowing that people actually wrote books, and that was a job role people had. So I think that was really influential. My dad was a poet. So there were always writers in and out of our house. My mom was always going to writers' conferences and writers' meetings. You know, and I think a lot of times kids look at those books, you know, on the books in the library or in the bookstore, and they think, well, I don't know who writes those, but it's not people like us. It's not like regular people, you know. And I knew that it was regular people that wrote those kinds of stories, people like us. So that was a whole different way to grow up, I think. A lot of people ask me why, because I never really was a writer until I decided to sit down and work on Dark and Shallow Lies. I spent my life working in the theater. And I think that's probably because I grew up, you know, in a family of writers. And I think, you know, probably you always kind of want to be like, well, you know, my family's all accountants, I'm going to be a ballerina, or, you know, whatever. So I knew that I wanted to, you know, go into something creative and expressive. But theater was always my art form, was always what I gravitated toward, until my little brother became the poet laureate of the state of Oklahoma. This is what happened. So when people ask me like, why did you start writing? I tell them it was so sibling rivalry. That's why. Because if your little brother becomes the poet laureate of the state that you live in, you cannot live this down. Like you've got to step up your game. You've got to do something. Otherwise you're going to be going around for the rest of your life and your people are going to be like, hey, wasn't your brother the poet laureate of Oklahoma? And you're like, yes, he was. Thank you for reminding me. So I felt like I needed to step up my literary game somehow. So sibling rivalry played a big part in it too. Yeah.
Curiosity question.
Sure.
What is the mindset of a writer's house or a household full of writers?
In the mindset, just kind of in general.
Like you said, growing up, speaking that
Yeah.
culture kind of for me, which obviously makes
Yeah.
sense, but like, what does that mean? Like,
So in our house, I grew up knowing that story was one of the driving forces in the world. And I grew up probably not having had anyone say this in so many words, but having it sort of illustrated around me and lived daily that story is probably the second biggest driving force in the world other than love. And story plays, we are as human beings so hardwired to crave story and to want that. And we're really, I mean, if you think about it, it's really weird that we care about like people that don't exist. I mean, it's bizarre. Like, why would we? Why do we care about these people that we know good and well are not real? Why do we cry over them? Why do we laugh at them? Why do we care what happens to them? And there's just something about human nature, that's the way we're wired, that's the way we're built. And having grown up with story, centered kind of at the center of everything, even my grandparents who grew up in rural Oklahoma in the southeastern Oklahoma and didn't have, never went to high school, had only like an 8th grade education at most. They were natural storytellers and born storytellers and going back generations in my family, storytellers. So that's probably the biggest part of it. Yeah.
well, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah. Yeah.
So theater question,
Okay.
what is your favorite show that you've seen at the O'Neill?
Oh my
I'm gonna be
gosh.
very specific because you can't pick from all of them. But
Yeah,
at the
so-
O'Neill.
At the O'Neill. Okay. Gosh. There's like I said, they develop new plays and new musicals. So a couple of things. There's a play called Good Boys and True, which is still one of my favorite plays. I saw it as a workshop production there. It went on to play off Broadway and had a limited Broadway run. And it's just a play that I always loved. Several of August Wilson's plays, if you know anything about theater, you know who August Wilson is, but he debuted a play there called Seven Guitars when I was there, which was a really beautiful story. For musicals, The Wild Party, if you're familiar with musical theater, are all Andrew Lippa's The Wild Party opened there while I was running the box office there, which was really cool to see. But my favorite musical that I ever saw there was a very strange and bizarre one woman show called The Passion of Lizzie Borden, which was kind of an operetta about Lizzie Borden, which I was sort of fascinated with at the time, and which evidently stuck with me because I'm spending the night tomorrow night at a Lizzie Borden bed and breakfast in Fall River. So it's kind of it comes full circle. But ever since I saw it, I was like, oh, this is really interesting. And so that's something that I wanted to do. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. Anybody else?
Any plans for a book set in Oklahoma?
Probably not.
There's some-
I've been there, done that. It's something interesting to me. A lot of my mom's books are set in Oklahoma. I won't say never. I do think eventually I'll do a book set in Arkansas, where I lived for 20 years. I went to college in Arkansas and lived and worked there. I'm really interested if any of you know anything about Arkansas. There's a town called Eureka Springs, which is just a really unusual little artist enclave. This very weird little hippie art town, kind of in the middle of very conservative Arkansas, which I think would be a really interesting place to set a story. So that's one that I'm kind of tinkering around with.
Nice.
Yeah.
So what would you, I mean, just based on everything you said,
Mhm.
what would you say is the difference between telling a story on stage and telling it,
Okay, so I actually do I do a lot of workshops on what writers can learn from actors and directors and kind of how that it's all storytelling, of course, it's just a different medium. So if you're talking about that from a writing standpoint, the biggest difference, of course, is that if you're sitting down to write a play, and I've written a couple of plays, all you have is dialogue, and that's it. You don't get the luxury of like character narration or scene setting or description or any of that stuff. It's all going to be in the dialogue, which is why I tell writers a lot that if you want to learn how to write dialogue, read plays. That was my suggestion, because that dialogue has to be so concise and so tight, and every single word has to do like 4 different things, for character development and plot development and all of that. So definitely that's the main difference, is that you have a lot more tools in your toolkit when you're writing a novel than when you're writing a play. As an actor or as a director, one of the things that I do love about writing is that I get to sort of play all of the parts. So I get to be the director, I get to be the sound designer, what are they hearing? I get to be the set designer, where are they in space? The costume designer, what do they have on? The lighting designer, all of that. So when I get to write, I get to be all of that rolled into one. In the theater, you usually just play one of those parts, and it's in a lot of ways it's a very collaborative art form. In some ways, at least in the initial parts of it, writing a novel is a very solitary sort of art form. It becomes more collaborative once you get to the point where you're sharing it with critique partners, or you're sharing it with your agent, or you're sharing it with your editor, and then all of those people come in to collaborate on it, and it takes that story and expands it and improves it, and does things to it that you kind of in your solitary little bubble might not have been able to do yourself, which is a really exciting thing to see too. But that's kind of the main difference, probably. Yeah. Okay, next.